Oh golly, what a round we had! I often say that usually when I process the round, they give me some stats and stuff as it's going through a little bit through the processing part, and I can usually easily predict which team is going to win. This was not one of those cases. This was a case where um, even after I had copied and pasted the data into my winner spreadsheet, I was unsure until I looked at the score which team was the winner. And even after I looked at the score, I went, "Oh golly, what a round!" If you like close football games, especially if they're well played football games, then yeah. And the other night, now there was Seattle and Arizona. It wasn't a particularly well played football game that ended in a tie even after overtime, which is of course somewhat unusual. But nonetheless, here we go. If I can get my computer to upload our. Maybe it's not going to do that. Maybe we'll just have to try the HTML version here and see if it'll do that. Okay. Not quite as visible for that. I apologize. Maybe I can make it just a hair bigger here. We'll see. yeah, it doesn't quite cut it. So we'll go back and because won't be able to see it quite as well. But in any event, here we go. We look at the first sheet and we at the first finance stuff here, and we got sales. We had Team Andrews kind of taking the lead, kind of coming out of nowhere. A team that hasn't shown up for the game until maybe this round. And EBIT was strong, and we get down to profits, and $8 million for Chester, pretty strong profits, but a little over $10 million for Andrews. But let's go back up and look at that ROE. Chester an ROE of 15.1% and Andrews an ROE of 13.1%. So Chester, with less profits, has a higher ROE. Think of all the assignment stuff that you've done that's related to that. In particular, what's that mean? Well, that means that Chester has less equity, obviously, right? It's got lower net income. Okay, but it still has a higher ROE, so it has less equity. It's interesting because even as such, its still leverage is less than Andrews, which kind of surprised me a little bit. I thought sometimes if you got a little less equity, you've got a little bit more leverage, and we'll see the equity numbers when we look at the balance sheets down below. Some other profits all around, except for Team Ferris struggling there a little bit with a loss. But no emergency loans, so that's a good deal. Contribution margins, again, Team Ferris struggling mightily there with only a 15% contribution margin. Baldwin struggling as well. Why the two teams? Why I put an emphasis on that contribution margin, because obviously why the two teams really struggled. And Erie, nice contribution margin here, but a little bit offset by such a high SG&A to sales. Their SG&A to sales is about 4% higher than any other team, and that's about $4 million. So you can see a huge $4 million in before tax profits based on their sales. And so that's you can see why that, or see that had a pretty big impact on Erie's profit there. So we come down and earnings per share. Ooh, interesting. Andrews made more, but they got more shares outstanding. Chester, look how close, even though it was a little over $2 million difference. So here's the thing. So Andrews had profit that was 25% higher, roughly. I'm just estimating that, than Team Chester, and yet an earnings per share that was only 14 cents higher, or about 2% higher. So different management, and it's all about this. It's all about the financial management, because you get Andrews here with 2.4 million shares outstanding, Chester with only 1.9 million. So Chester won the ROE battle. Andrews barely hung on to win the earnings per share battle. And they were both both relatively close. Okay, and as we can see, let's go along here. You see, Chester paid a dividend. Remember, we went back up to that ROE number. Okay, Chester paid a dividend of $4, or about $8 million. We'll see that when we get to the cash flow. So they paid about an $8 million dividend. That made the difference, no doubt, in Chester's ROE. Right? Paid a dividend, lowered assets. Okay. And when you lower assets and you don't affect liabilities, you also lower the equity. Okay, if you go back to your accounting equation, so you lower the equity, and then you have a higher ROE as a result. So Chester did all those things. Now we see a little debt. Ferris took on some debt. Andrews has some debt, whereas the other four teams here in the middle, so our two bookends are using a little debt. Ferris had really high leverage if you went up, though. But they had an emergency loan, I think, from last year that they were trying to get taken care of. But our two bookends are using a little bit of debt. Our teams here in the middle are apparently trying to shed maybe debt, or at least not incur anymore, and maybe let some of that long-term debt run off. So net income, here we go, kind of cruise down through this. We're seeing some decent depreciation here for Team Andrews. Maybe they're taking on a little equipment. Not a huge difference, okay, but a little bit. Inventory. So most teams ran off. Ferris in particular ran off a lot of inventory. Okay, that we see. So we must have had a decent amount of inventory there in round one, and we ran off a lot. The exception there is Team Digby, which must have accumulated. By that I mean had more inventory this year than last. Plant improvements. So Team Andrews really the only team to spend any substantial amount of money. Digby a little bit. And I shouldn't say that. Net money, the only team to spend net money on improvements. We see some positives here, but that doesn't mean that they didn't sell capacity. And we've kind of determined that if we had a positive number here, right, that it's sale of capacity. I don't know what else would do that. But they may have reinvested that then in other areas. We don't know. Yep, Chester paid that approximately $8 million, a little less than $8 million dividend. Both Chester and Digby bought back a little bit of stock, reducing their number of shares outstanding. I wonder if, in Chester's case, if that was the max they could do, and I wonder if they could have done just a little bit more. That might be a good question. I'm gonna put that in there. If Chester, how much more stock would Chester have to have bought back in order to win the battle for earnings per share, which lost only by 14%. So we're seeing some teams retire some long-term debt and even some current debt, but taking on a little bit. Not very aggressive. I would call it. We're seeing non-aggressive tactics here. So while this is fun and it's kind of close, I still am not seeing teams that are aggressively pursuing their strategy. Total current assets. Chester's a tiny company here, right? Okay, so here's why Chester. Look at that, just a small amount of cash. Cash alone, $20 million difference than Andrews is why Chester had a higher ROE. Boom, right there. Because not a lot of difference here. Inventory is big though too. $10 million difference there, and so a whole $33 million difference in assets. Okay, plant and equipment even a little bit smaller, so $50 million difference there, and at the same time they have quite a bit less debt, but their leverage number wasn't too bad, and so total equity, that's what we look at here. 26 million difference. Why Chester had the higher ROE. Okay, no question about that. Okay. And still, when I go back up, 2 and I think I go to 2.25. So 2% is still not, I would say, not terribly leveraged. So Digby is, I would say, in my opinion, way low on the leverage. Chester and Erie pretty low, Andrews pretty low, Baldwin kind of getting there, Ferris obviously a little bit overboard. Okay, and again, probably because they were dealing with some of that emergency debt, I think, that they had from last round, if I'm not mistaken. Other things exciting here on this thing. Now we're seeing a little bit more Andrews has gone big, at least in terms of total equity. But again, a lot of that is up here in its current assets compared to the other teams, with the exception of Ferris, which has a lot of inventory still on hand. Okay. And its plant and equipment is big, so Andrews has also spent some money there. I think we'll see too that they've developed a new product, and that might be it. The income statement, we look at what was it? Erie had the big SG&A number. Actually spent less money than Andrews, but just didn't get the efficiency out of it. So Andrews was able to drive sales, okay, with less money proportionately, anyhow, in sales and promotion. What's that tell you? Typically, that tells me then that they're paying a little bit more attention. This is a generalization, but maybe paying a little bit more attention to the customer buying criteria. That's just so vital. Okay, marketing can play a big role. Certainly, if a company spends twice as much in marketing as another company, and they're equal in the customer buying criteria, the company that spent twice as much is going to sell a lot more. Okay, but if you're trying to offset poor decisions in that customer buying criteria by spending a lot of money in marketing, it might not be that effective. Interest, look at Ferris paying a lot of interest. Again, that's some short-term debt. Okay, oodles. I know oodles is not an official word, I don't think. I should look that up. It's one of my favorite words, but there is all kinds of capacity. So we're sitting, in fact, Andrews is the only team that used, well, I shouldn't say that, Andrews and Ferris, again, the bookends, the only two teams that actually used a little bit of their second shift, and not much. Okay, so we've got just boatloads, oodles and oodles of capacity. So we were talking about capacity, I think, and I kind of got interrupted there for a little bit. But we scroll down and see, what kind of changes. And look at Andrews. Andrews made some changes here. It looks like, did they reduce some capacity here? I don't remember. Wasn't it? I'd have to go back and look and see where people started. But it's kind of interesting. It looks to me, just glancing at it here, I'm up here saying, man, look at all the boatloads of capacity that we have, and we do. And yet it really appears to me that folks' teams have added capacity, kind of exacerbating the problem, if you want to look at it that way. Wow, yeah. Inventories, we kind of cruise down. We look here in the traditional segment. There's quite a bit of inventory. In the low end, it looks like Ferris, their products, or their two products here, both in the low end now, or one would have been in the traditional segment. And so maybe there's not so much in the traditional as what I thought, but quite a bit. There's quite a few. There's $1 million to about $1.5 million maybe in the traditional segment. In the low end, there's $1.5 million. $1.6 million or so. So about the same between the traditional, and kind of scattered in the higher end stuff. Although in the size, Fume here had a lot in inventory. Interesting, dynamics here. Look at the pricing that we got going on down here. Looks like they're really trying to be competitive price-wise here. I think they did some of the same stuff in the practice rounds and just absolutely killing the contribution margin, and yet not necessarily generating any more sales when you look at it from that standpoint. So, interesting philosophy. I'm not sure where Ferris is heading. Maybe we'll find out over time. That's one option, is that we would find out over time. The other option is they're not quite sure where they're heading either. But I jest. Sorry. I shouldn't pick on any one team. Traditional segment, Baldwin Chester kind of dominating. Andrews Digby, but nobody really taking advantage, not meeting their potential, those types of things. Kind of an interesting setup here in the low end. You got Ebb, which is already just about falling out of contention there. Interesting. It's going to be out of the main circle here if nothing is done with the product. It's kind of interesting how, and I guess the question is, why do you engineer a product. You're spending money to make a product not fit inside the circle. And I know you're trying to approach the ideal position there, but of course you could not spend any money and it would get to the ideal position on its own, because the ideal position changes. But you can see that hurt Erie a lot. At least they anticipated that. Maybe that's part of their plan, is to just let that thing go. It could be. Chester missed out on some sales there. Kind of spread out a little bit, both between Andrews and Ferris, as to which teams took advantage of that. Ferris kind of dominating in the low end. Maybe that's their philosophy with two products in there now. That could be. High end, a little bit more. You had some actual. So somebody gave up the potential there, and that looks like primarily Digby, a little bit Erie, and Andrews and Chester were able to take advantage of that. A lot more competitive in terms of placement than we were in the practice rounds. That's good to see. And I would say the same thing here in the performance segment. Again, we see Andrews and Erie really dominating there, and other teams kind of falling out of the way a little bit. Look at that, Andrews with 28, or its aft product with 28% of the market, and positioned okay, not positioned that much better than Dot. I'm wondering why it sold so much more. In fact, the performance size, those things were about the same, and not so much why it sold more. It sold more because aft had more in terms of product. But let's take a look here, see why Dot didn't have more potential. Lower price, a little lower on the MTBF. Look at the age, maybe. Ideal age is 1, and aft is quite a bit closer to that ideal. And then your other big factor there, of course, would be marketing. So between the age and the marketing, and those are the things I like to look at. In this case, Dot sold what it expected to sell. Okay, what it was expected to sell, which 414 units, and I don't know if Dot had a bunch left in inventory up there. I don't know if they made a bunch more. But how could it have approached aft? Again, it's really, really close in terms of the positioning, which is the second leading. Okay, it's pretty close there. It's a little less on the MTBF, but I don't think that would have had a huge impact, and lower in price, which obviously didn't have. But you got age and you got marketing, right? Two big factors there. So Andrew spent a little bit more in those areas. And maybe we see something a little similar here. Again, we had Andrews with a big potential, and did spend. Okay, so potential and didn't make enough. And Buddy did well. Okay, what are the big factors here? So ideal position, we need a performance. So you'd have to say that Buddy was positioned a little bit better, a little lower age, and I think age is also 1.5 is an important thing. So a little bit closer probably to the age. MTBF though lower, that's interesting, and not a huge factor. Wow. And Buddy's MTBF is actually even lower than the wow. That kind of surprises me. Be interesting to see if that holds up. And didn't spend a lot there. Very interesting. Okay, but Andrews ran out of product. Would have sold a lot more than Baldwin. Probably about 10% more if it would have made more. Okay. So the actual versus potentials there, seeing this, and again, I think I'm seeing a little better placement here, although we certainly see some teams not being competitive. I think we're seeing more teams that are being competitive, at least at the high end. A little more interesting stuff going on. Look at that traditional segment. That's kind of interesting. It almost seems kind of void. Wow. HR, we're seeing some teams spend some money on HR a little bit, so we're seeing some progress there in terms of saving money. And again, those savings will continue throughout, so it could be big. TQM, we don't do yet. So basically a wrap up there, and I think I'm going to talk briefly about the winter spreadsheet, which I normally don't in this review, but I just kind of want to show you guys how that turned out. And again, this stuff up here is stuff that I just copy and paste, and I don't use all of it in my score. but it's just easier to copy and paste it into my spreadsheet. Make it a little bit bigger, okay, and scroll down and keep everybody in suspense here. So, here we go. Earnings per share. We knew that Andrews won the earnings per share battle, but we also knew that Chester won the ROE battle. Okay, and so only 1/2 point now separates those two. Okay, and so we scroll down and a contribution margin. Andrews was better than Chester, but Erie actually won that contribution margin battle. But so now Andrews, what's a 1.5 ahead now? Yeah, 1.5. But Chester won the stock price battle, and so now it's just a 0.5 point again. But Andrews won the profit battle, and so it's a 1.5 again. But on the cash flow side, Chester won by 1.5, so we're now even. Did I make any adjustments for strategy? I did not. Interesting. So what do we have? We have, before deductions, we have a tie right now between Andrews and Chester, 92.5 points each. And we scroll down, and there's no deductions, no team had an emergency loan, we knew that. Leverage, the only team that had too much leverage was Ferris, we saw that up above. How about working capital? Oh no. Chester gets a deduction for working capital of 5 points, and thus making Andrews our winner. I kind of got to go up and see what its working capital was. 16 million, 20 is kind of the threshold. So some of the things that Chester did that lowered its equity and whatnot, lowered its working capital a little bit too. And so not far below the threshold, probably not horrible, but a little bit penalized, and separating the two. So we got to give the victory here to Andrews. Sorry, Chester, but better luck next time as we move into round 3.